Have you ever opened a blank document for your literature review and immediately felt, no matter how much you've read, it was never quite enough? Or felt like with every reading, your project became less and less clear until you're uncertain what your project is actually about? Hey, co-authors. In this episode, we'll demystify the introduction and literature review chapters of your thesis and dissertation and talk about why this stage of writing feels so overwhelming. We'll unpack real pressures underneath it and why readings should narrow your focus, not expand it forever. I'll also offer practical suggestions for how to start writing in ways that are productive and sustainable. Let's dive in. Whenever I was working on my dissertation, I think one of the hardest things about that process was just getting started and getting the first couple of chapters written. Because at that point, my only other experience up until that point about writing for long extended periods of time on a project had been my thesis, and that had been 3 years before. And so other than that, almost all of my writing had been either papers that were for my classes or projects that were either started in a class and then became an article or a research project or some other more intensive form of short-term writing rather than it being a long-term project. And so I remember whenever I was working on my dissertation, it took me 3 drafts of my literature review before I felt like I was in a place where I was planning what I wanted to write, then writing it, and then editing what I had written in a way that was sustainable and allowed me to be successful ultimately in my dissertation project. But that was over the course of many months and, like I said, multiple drafts until I started to really grasp this concept of what it meant to read more scholarship than I had ever read for a single project before in my entire life, synthesize that into an argument that worked for my particular project, and then write that in a way that was compelling and made logical sense to my audience. And so that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about how your introduction chapter, your chapter 1, and your literature review chapter, often your chapter 2, how those things should be set up if you're working on your thesis or your dissertation. Okay, so let's dive in.
Are you interested in mastering scholarly writing, developing productivity, and increasing impact, all while staying healthy? Then welcome to the Publishing Academic Research Podcast. My name is Dr. Kyle Ruddick, and I'm a full professor and writing coach who's dedicated to making sure you break through whatever is stopping you from reaching your scholarly goals. I meet so many scholars who have creative, innovative, and daring ideas, but can never seem to get those projects from proposals to print. I want you to get your work in the hands of people who will read it and appreciate it. So let's get into this week's big idea.
So before I get into the details here, I do want to just take a step back and say, every different disciplines and even different departments within the same discipline have different approaches to writing your dissertation or your thesis. So they might ask you to write the projects in different ways. Obviously, you should always be following your department and your advisor before you listen to any schmuck on a podcast about how to write these things. But, over the course of my career, I see a lot of these things are pretty standardized across a lot of disciplines and a lot of departments. And so there's probably some good advice in here for you, even if you end up having to change things a little bit. I will also say that at this point, what you are probably looking at is what's called the prospectus defense, which is the first defense of your thesis or your dissertation, if your department does that. So for me, whenever I'm chairing a committee with a student, I typically have that student write the first 3 chapters, which is the introduction, the literature review, and the methods section, as their prospectus. Other types of disciplines do this differently. So for example, if you're in the more humanistic side of scholarship, you might write an extended 20 or 30 page argument, and then that gets incorporated into the larger thesis or dissertation project. Again, you should be talking with your advisor and seeing what it is they want to see for your particular project. But I'm going to talk about it in the way that I teach it, which is each chapter has a specific purpose, and that those first 3 chapters form your prospectus defense. And no worries, if you're wondering what a prospectus defense is, one of my later episodes is going to be on the prospectus and the final defense. Okay, so you don't need to worry about it for right now. So whenever you're working on your chapters 1 and 2, the first thing that I will say is that you might not start by writing your chapter 1. And the reason for that is because that chapter is the introduction to your thesis or dissertation project. You have not written the other 4 chapters yet, or however many chapters you're going to end up having. And so it's kind of hard to introduce a project if you don't have everything else written. And so some advisors will tell you to not write chapter 1 until you've finished the entire project. For me, I'm the type of writer that I always start with the introduction, just like I always, whenever I sit down to eat, I eat things one thing at a time. like a psychopath. So I always start with chapter 1, and then I go to chapter 2, and then chapter 3. But again, your advisor might ask you to not write this chapter until the end. That's perfectly fine. If they do, then what I would say is your chapter 1 needs to have 5 different components to it that are very important. First, you should introduce the overarching problem that your thesis or your dissertation is trying to address. This is not necessarily the same thing as your research question, hypothesis, research purpose, whatever that is. That's the more specific entrance that you have to this larger problem. And we've talked about this before, right? The idea of the big problem here is like a diamond. Your project, even though it's a dissertation or thesis, even though it's 100 pages, 200 pages, 500 pages long, it's still only ever going to be able to address 1, maybe 2 in a particularly long dissertation facets of the diamond, right? You don't get to study the whole diamond. That's what the career of scholarship is. That's what a program of scholarship is. But you're not going to be able to do everything about the problem, but you are going to be able to introduce us to that larger problem. So, for example, if you're in education research and you're studying equity gaps between different racial groups in education and how those gaps manifest in the ways that teachers discipline students of color differently than white students. So that disciplining might be the specific entrance, but the problem is equity gaps overall, right? So again, what you're trying to do is establish this larger problem to convey to your reader both the harm that is being done by the problem that as it currently stands, right? What is this exigence, something that we need to do something about? And also its significance. How big of a problem is it? How many people does it touch? How likely is the problem to occur? Right? Is it something that affects everyone or certain types of people or whatever it might be? But you're introducing us to this problem. And the next thing that you will want to do is you will have a brief section that shows a very general overview of the literature about this particular problem and how these past conversations have addressed the overall problem that you're talking about and the specific entrance to that problem that is going to be your research project. That will in turn lead you to your third section, which is where you will establish what your particular entrance to that problem is, right? So we're moving down. Big picture problem, research that's been out there on this problem, and now your particular entrance into this problem and how you're going to be adding to the conversations about this particular problem. So if we take that example again of disciplining students based on race differently in classroom management, there's all sorts of research that's out there that shows how that is a matter of racial disparity, how that's a part of unconscious bias, that it's a part of racial prejudice that is overt. It's not unconscious. It's actually very conscious. There is research about the outcomes, right? How that affects students of color and how they are placed in special needs classes or in disciplinary halls like detention or even the juvenile justice system, right? There's all these different things. You have to pick one of those, and then you're showing how you add onto the conversation by addressing what's called the gap in the literature. What hasn't been studied about this thing yet, and how is your thesis or dissertation addressing that gap in the literature? That should in turn lead to the fourth thing, which is your research questions, your hypotheses, or your research purpose. That should be stated very clearly for your reader. And that research question, hypothesis, or research purpose should be flowing logically from all of the stuff that you've written up into this point. Finally, and again, this is why some advisors will tell you to write this last, the last section of your introduction should be a chapter by chapter outline. Now for me, what I tell students to do is I ask them to write chapter 1 first, and then I have them write in this section what their proposed next 4 chapters are going to look like, and to give a 2 to 3 sentence overview about what each one of those chapters is called and what its function is and what it's going to accomplish. So it's more of a proposed outline than an actual outline. Again, your advisor might tell you to not write that at all until the end, or like me, they have you write that. And then whenever you get done with the entire project, you go back and you revise that from being, these are the things I'm going to do, into these are the things that I did do in the course of my project. Overall, I would say your chapter 1 is typically between 10 to 20 pages in length. It can be a little bit shorter or a little bit longer, but certainly you don't want to go much shorter than 10 pages or much longer than about 25 or 30 pages. Because again, what you're trying to do here is just introduce this topic and its importance to your reader in such a way as if someone were to pick up your thesis thesis or your dissertation, and they were wondering, is this something that is going to be worthwhile for my area of study? They can read chapter 1 and get a pretty good idea of what you did and why. So you don't want to scare them off by having a 50-page chapter 1, right? Nor do you want to have so little in your chapter 1 that they don't really know if it's worth it or not, and so they end up just discarding your dissertation in lieu of reading something else. So usually I would say, again, around 10 to 20 pages, give or take, is about what you're shooting for here. Now, after you're done with that, it's on to the literature review. And what I would say, your literature review in a thesis or dissertation typically has 4 major components in order for it to be successful. The first thing that you need to think about is, what are the components of your research and how are you going to convey those in a way to your reader that makes organizational sense? To me, what I encourage young writers to do is to start off the literature review with an introduction that's usually 2 to 5 paragraphs that will, again, reassert what the big picture problem or issue or exigence is that is being addressed, because you can't expect your reader is necessarily going to read your thesis or dissertation in linear order, and so they might not read chapter 1. They might just start with chapter 2. So your chapter 2 is going to start off with an overview of the exigence, problem, or issue that you are addressing through the course of this. This might be a little bit more detailed, but not terribly much so, because you're trying to move your reader into the literature that you're discussing. After those introductory paragraphs, I encourage writers to approach writing their project with 3 levels of writing. And not every project has all 3 levels. You might have 1 or 2 or all 3, but if all 3 do appear, I typically want them to appear in this order, which is to say, the first section should be the overarching theoretical framework which you're using. Now, you might not have a theory or a philosophy or a framework, so if you don't, then you can skip this. But if you do, I typically like to have the theoretical part up front, so that way, as a reader, I know what sort of paradigm and language and thinking tools that you're going to be using in order for you to make sense of the problem that you talked about in the introduction of this literature review. The next section that I typically have students do is the conceptual level. So here you might have the specific variables that are under investigation, or the specific concepts that you are going to deploy to look at your data or your texts or whatever it is that you are analyzing. But here it's a level of abstraction lower than the theory, because your theory might actually have many different concepts, ideas, variables, especially if you're doing a more humanistic project where you might have a framework that's something like symbolic interactionalism or Foucault's notion of power, or, something like that, where, those are perspectives that have so much going on in them that even if you do a sort of synthesized summary of them in the theory section, in the concept section, you're still going to want to focus on a specific idea that is deployed in those frameworks that you are going to be using. And so this concept level then begins to narrow down your focus of what it is that you are wanting to talk about. The third section is the specific context or phenomena or dynamic that you're applying these theories and concepts to. So again, as you imagine this is moving us down and becoming more and more specific, from our theory to our specific concepts, from those concepts down to the actual way that people experience their realities or whatever it is that you are investigating, and then giving us as the readers the background on those things, on this particular phenomenon, and how the language that you've deployed up into this point helps us make sense of this phenomenon in such a way as to naturally lead us, again, to your research questions, hypotheses, or research purpose. So each one of these things moves you down. Now, again, you don't have to have all 3 of those. You might not have a named theory, or maybe your advisor is the type of person who's like, well, a conceptual framework is a theory, so that's kind of the same thing. You don't need to really get bogged down in the details of naming stuff. What's more important is that you're moving your reader down from more theoretical to less theoretical, so that way you can ground those ideas into the specificity of the topic that you're trying to talk about. All of this, in turn, leads us to the end of this, which is the hypotheses, research questions, and research purpose, which should be the last thing to appear in your literature review before you have the next chapter, which is the method section, which we'll talk about in another episode. So, knowing then the overall parts of the literature review, let's talk about some of the problems that I oftentimes see whenever people are writing their literature reviews. The first problem is that you see a lot of people who summarize the literature instead of synthesizing it. So the most egregious example of this is whenever a author will have one paragraph per citation, right? This author said this, and then it's a summary of the article, and then next paragraph, and then this author said this, and then so on and so forth. And it basically looks like a annotated bibliography written in literature review form. But even less egregiously, you'll see students who, instead of reading across multiple sources and then thinking to themselves, how do I incorporate the findings and components of this literature into my own writing? Instead, they think, well, these are all scholars, they're all published, they're all smarter than me, so I have to give them all of this time and space in my writing in order to showcase the smart things that they say, because I don't feel very confident about me having smart things to say. And so they over-summarize by giving way too much detail and way too much space for every one of these studies, rather than thinking to themselves, how do I synthesize across those things in a way that makes them add to the way that I see the literature proceeding on this particular topic. The second thing that I oftentimes see is what is a lot of what I call citation dumping. This oftentimes comes from writer insecurity, and young writers will do this in one of two ways. Either every sentence that they have has a citation. Even if it's the same citation as the previous sentence, then they just keep citing things. So every sentence has some source to it. This is really less egregious. This is still a bad way of writing because it indicates a lack of security, a lack of confidence in your own writing. But it's especially bad if you have to write in APA and even in some ways MLA format because of the parenthetical citations for years or page numbers. If things get cited over and over and over again, it just becomes a slog to read. It's less of a problem in Chicago, but it's still not fun. And again, it just indicates a lack of confidence. The other way that I see this is that students will have a sentence and then it'll have like 20 citations behind that sentence, and then they never return to it again. To me, there are times whenever it's important for you to show that you've done the reading, and you might have those long parenthetical citations, so that way you can show that you're hitting the most important parts of the conversations in this field. But more often than not, I would say that you don't really want to go beyond 2 or 3 within a parenthetical citation because A, it disrupts the reading and it disrupts the flow in a way that makes it just a slog to read. It makes it very laborious. But then B, if you're citing things like that in those long parentheticals, but then never using that research ever again, then all you're really doing is padding your reference section. Now, whenever you become a scholar, you do that so that way you self-cite yourself all the time. And then you can get mad at people whenever they tell you not to do that, which has definitely happened to me on multiple occasions as an editor, because I absolutely hate it whenever scholars do this. So don't get in the habit of doing this, and especially don't get in the habit of doing it with your own work, which you then never really use again in the rest of your writing. If you're going to use something, use it. If you're not. But don't just throw citations into a long parenthetical citation just so that way you can pad your reference section. It's not a good look and it's bad writing. The third thing I see is that a lot of young writers get bogged down in trying to read everything. They think that unless they do an exhaustive literature review, that they're going to miss some important citation or some big document that happened in the field, and as a result, they're going to look foolish to everyone. If you do miss something is that big of a deal, then your advisor should be catching that, and they should let you know, and you can read it and then put it in. And if they make you feel bad about it, then your advisor's a jerk. I'm sorry. If you're doing your due diligence and you're reading dozens of articles in order for you to create your literature review and you happen to miss one, no one should make you feel bad about that. Now, if you're not doing your due diligence and you've way underread, then yeah, that's a problem. But you should be doing the work to make sure that you are finding those pieces that have been cited the most and that have been the most influential on this particular topic. And everything else after that becomes more or less important as you're moving forward. This leads into the final problem, which is that a lot of students, whenever they're writing their literature reviews, they try to write their literature reviews while they're still reading. And on some level, this makes sense. You feel like you've got a small window of time. You have multiple drafts that you're trying to get back and forth with your advisor. You don't feel like you have the luxury of just reading without producing something. And in fact, your advisor themselves might be someone who is pressuring you to come up with some sort of output in order for you to justify that you're making progress on this thing. But you can really tell whenever a person is still reading while they're writing, because their prose starts to veer off in different directions as they read this or that article. They have some new flashy idea that came to them while they were reading something. They start chasing after that. They have some new argument. They have some insight that doesn't quite connect with the rest of the stuff that they're trying to do. It becomes very haphazard, and there's no clear through line of logic that's leading you through your literature review. And so it's very important that you are identifying the core pieces that you need for your three major sections, right? Your theory, concept, and phenomenon level sections in your literature review. That then after you identify those core readings, that you might then have a certain number that you allow yourself of ancillary readings that help flesh those things out. But then once you make that reading list, and as you've read it, made notes to yourself, and then made the outline to yourself about how you're going to incorporate those into your literature review, that you stick to that religiously and don't deviate from it unless your advisor says, hey, you missed X, Y, or Z, and you should throw this in here. Otherwise, it's much better for you to have a focused, clearly organized literature review that may miss one or two readings, and for you to continue to try to read and write to make sure that you're hitting every nuance and every new update, in which case then you will quickly find yourself incapable of writing in a way that is clear and organized for your reader. Overall, then, whenever you're writing your literature review chapter, you should be thinking to yourself, how can I make this literature review an argument for the importance of my work and for my particular perspective, rather than just a summary? And if you go back in the episodes, I actually have another podcast episode on writing literature reviews, writing paragraph structure, all sorts of things that can help you with this. But it's really important that you have very clear logic that you're going through in your literature review. So you can think to yourself, in this conversation about this particular topic, what is it that scholars disagree on? What do they agree on? What are assumptions that they've had? And how has the conversation proceeded in such a way as to create a space for your particular project? Because ultimately, that's what's important here. No one else's work in this literature review is as important as your particular way that you're going to contribute to it, which is your research question, hypotheses, or research purpose. Everything else is there in service of justifying your project. So anytime that you think to yourself, I'm not giving enough time to other scholars, maybe, but more likely that is a sign of your lack of confidence, insecurity in your own idea, and instead you should be thinking to yourself, how can I make other people's work, other people's voices in this conversation, how can I have them create the platform or create the foundation by which I get to stand on stage and talk about the thing that is important to me and how it connects to those previous conversations. So as you're working on your chapters 1 and 2, it's really important that you're staying organized. You know that you have done enough reading and enough work on those sections whenever you can explain the main debates of this particular scholarly field without any notes. If you can, off the top of your head, articulate succinctly and powerfully the stakes of the conversation, what your theory and concepts are, and why your particular approach matters in that conversation, then that is a good signal to me that you have a good handle on your project. If I ask you what your thesis or dissertation is, and you have to go on a 10-minute long rambling story about all the things that have gone on, not only is that just wholly uninteresting as a listener, but it means that you don't have a firm grasp on what it is that you're trying to get at. You should be able to tell me in less than 30 seconds what your project is about and why it matters. If you continue to read, and every time that you read a new article, it feels more repetitive, it feels like it's not really adding on a whole lot of new knowledge for you and your project, that's a good sign. That means that you probably can stop reading and start on the writing part. Now, if you are reading things and every time you read a new thing, you're like, gosh, I need to add that in here, or, oh gosh, that's something I'd never thought of before, or, oh gosh, that's a finding that I hadn't really accounted for yet. That's an indicator that you need to keep reading and you need to keep outlining your literature review before you start actually writing. So just in closing, I would say whenever, as you are reading for your literature review, every time that you read something, you are reading for how it adds on to your perspective and to your project. So readings should always narrow your focus and help you hone in on the thing that you are actually interested in. And you should not have an instance where every time you read something, it feels like it makes the project bigger. If that's the case, that is an indicator that you don't have a strong enough voice or perspective on this yet, and that it's being swayed too much by these readings. You need to talk to your advisor and make sure that you have a stronger grasp on exactly what it is that you're going to be doing if this is what's happening to you. Okay, so that's going to about wrap it up for me, folks. Again, I appreciate you all listening. This is part 4 in my 10-part series on doing theses and dissertations. If you have other questions, or if you have habits, tips, tricks, rituals, things that you do or have done in order for you to get your thesis or dissertation done, by all means, reach out to me. My contact information is in the podcast description. I'm happy to give you a shout out if you want me to, or you can remain anonymous. Either way, I just want to make sure that I'm giving you all the best information that I can. So if there's anything that I can address or anything that I can add, I'm happy to always revisit this conversation. If you find yourself in your thesis or dissertation and you need another person to bounce ideas off of or talk to or work through something, reach out to me. First 30 minutes of any consultation is free. You can set up an appointment with me. Happy to talk with you over Zoom so that way we can get to the bottom of what's giving you trouble, so that way you can get on to the next big thing in your life. Okay? So thank you again, and I will see you in next week's episode.
Hey, co-authors, what's stopping your best ideas from becoming your next big publication? Brilliant research shouldn't die in your drafts folder. Now's the time to bridge the gap between the possible and the published. You can support this podcast by subscribing to it, leaving a positive review, assigning it to your classes, or sharing it with a colleague. Let me know what I can do to make this the best podcast resource for you. And if you'd like to know more about my writing coach services, then you can find my information in the podcast description and set up an appointment. I'll be back next week with another episode. But until then, keep healthy, keep writing, and don't let reviewer 2 get you down.